By the time the alarms were triggered, the damage was already done. Inside a sealed concrete cell, an inmate had stopped responding. There was no noise, no movement, no warning visible from the corridor. For staff, it was another emergency inside a place built to contain emergencies. For the outside world, it was something most people would never hear about at all. That silence is the outcome this facility is designed around. It is not accidental. It is the product of a system that values total control above all else. The prison is the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, specifically the Eyman unit, home to some of the most restrictive housing in the state. Its reputation did not come from rumor or exaggeration. It came from policies, court records, investigations, and the accumulated consequences of how people are confined there. Eyman is part of a sprawling desert complex southeast of Phoenix. It houses multiple units, including high custody and segregated housing designed for inmates classified as the most dangerous or disruptive in Arizona's prison system. Over time, Eyman became known not for rehabilitation, but for isolation. And that reputation hardened as conditions inside its most restrictive units became harder to defend and harder to explain. The men held there are locked down for most of the day. In many cases, they are confined alone, inside small concrete cells, with limited human contact. Movement is tightly controlled. Meals are passed through slots. Recreation, when allowed, often takes place in individual enclosures. The structure is deliberate, built to minimize risk to staff and other inmates. But the cost of that design has been documented repeatedly. What made Eyman stand out was not just that it was harsh, but that it was persistent. While other states began to scale back long-term solitary confinement, Arizona continued to rely on it heavily. Eyman's housing units became long-term destinations, not temporary placements. And that raised a question that would follow the prison for years. What happens when isolation is no longer a short-term control measure, but a way of life? The first major cracks appeared not through internal reports, but through lawsuits. Civil rights attorneys began documenting conditions inside Eyman that they argued violated constitutional standards. Inmate accounts described cells with little natural light, limited access to mental health care, and prolonged isolation lasting months or years. These were not isolated claims. They were supported by patterns. Court filings revealed inmates held in segregation for 22 to 24 hours a day. Some were released from their cells only a few times a week, sometimes less. Contact with other people was minimal and often conducted through doors or restraints. For inmates with pre-existing mental illness, the effects were predictable. Symptoms worsened. Self-harm incidents increased. Requests for treatment multiplied. But that wasn't the worst part. Records showed that even when mental health deterioration was evident, removal from isolation was rare. The classification system that sent inmates to Eyman's most restrictive housing was rigid. Once placed there, getting out was difficult. Behavioral improvement did not always lead to reclassification. In some cases, inmates cycled between isolation and brief transfers, only to return again. The Arizona Department of Corrections defended its policies by pointing to safety concerns. Eyman housed inmates who had assaulted staff, organized violence, or posed ongoing security risks. Officials argued that the level of control was necessary. And in some cases, that was true. But the lawsuits focused on what happened after months or years under those conditions. One case described an inmate with documented mental illness who spent years in isolation. Medical experts testified that the environment aggravated his condition. Another detailed repeated suicide attempts that occurred despite monitoring. Investigators noted that crisis interventions often returned inmates to the same cells that triggered the behavior. What followed shocked even experienced observers. Federal courts began ordering changes. Judges required Arizona to improve mental health screenings, reduce isolation for vulnerable inmates, and increase oversight. But compliance was slow. Reports showed that policy changes on paper did not always translate to changes on the ground. Staffing shortages, overcrowding, and institutional resistance limited progress. Meanwhile, Deaths continued to occur inside Arizona prisons, including at Eyman. Some were from natural causes. Others involved suicide. Each incident added to the record. And each raised the same unresolved question. How much isolation is too much before it becomes dangerous? The physical design of Eyman intensified the issue. Cells are constructed of concrete, with solid doors and narrow windows. Sound carries poorly. Visual checks can be limited. That design enhances security but reduces sensory input. Over time, that deprivation has measurable effects. Studies cited in court proceedings linked prolonged isolation to anxiety, hallucinations, depression, and cognitive impairment. Arizona was not unaware of this research. Internal documents acknowledged the risks. Yet the system remained in place. Officials argued there were no alternatives for certain inmates. Critics countered that the classification process itself created the problem by funneling too many people into the highest security levels. Few people outside ever learned what happened next. As lawsuits progressed, outside monitors were granted access to Eyman. Their findings were blunt. They described inadequate mental health staffing, inconsistent treatment plans, and a lack of meaningful review for inmates held in segregation. In some cases, inmates were documented as decompensating psychologically while remaining in isolation. These findings forced the state into a series of legal settlements. Arizona agreed to limit the use of solitary confinement for inmates with serious mental illness. Time caps were introduced. Review processes were revised. On paper, Eyman was supposed to change. But the reality was uneven. Some inmates were transferred out of the most restrictive units. Others remained. Reports from advocacy groups suggested that isolation was still being used extensively, though sometimes under different classifications. The physical environment did not change. The cells remained the same. The routines remained rigid. And the consequences continued to surface quietly. Former inmates described the difficulty of adjusting after release from Eyman. Sensory overload. Social withdrawal. Difficulty following basic routines. These were not dramatic claims. They were consistent descriptions, repeated across interviews and declarations. For those transferred back into general population, the transition was often turbulent. Correctional officers also reported strain. Working in high-security isolation units carries its own toll. Staff shortages increased over time. Burnout became common. High turnover rates made consistency harder to maintain. That instability fed back into the system, increasing reliance on strict control measures. Arizona's prison system faced a contradiction it could not fully resolve. Eyman existed to control the most dangerous inmates. But the conditions used to maintain that control often created new problems. Mental health crises increased management challenges. Isolation reduced behavior in the short term but worsened it over time. That contradiction became impossible to ignore. National attention turned to Arizona as part of a broader examination of solitary confinement in the United States. Advocacy groups cited Eyman as an example of how extreme isolation persists despite evidence of harm. Lawmakers began questioning whether the approach actually improved safety. In response, the state made further adjustments. Step-down programs were expanded. Inmates could earn increased privileges through compliance. Out-of-cell time increased for some classifications. But progress depended heavily on staffing and resources, both of which remained limited. And still, the central question lingered. If isolation is meant to be temporary, what happens when it becomes permanent? Eyman's history shows how systems drift. Policies created for emergencies become routine. Facilities designed for short-term control become long-term storage. Oversight mechanisms struggle to keep up. And accountability often arrives only after damage is done. The prison continues to operate today. It remains one of the most restrictive environments in Arizona's correctional system. Conditions have changed in some ways and stayed the same in others. Lawsuits forced reforms, but they did not erase the years that came before. For the inmates who lived through that period, the consequences were not abstract. They were physical, psychological, and lasting. For the staff, the burden was constant. And for the public, the story remained largely invisible. Until it wasn't. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe, because the next one goes even deeper. Eyman is not unique. But it is instructive. It shows how easily control can replace care, how quickly isolation can become policy, and how slowly systems change once they are built. The silence inside those cells was not an accident. It was the result of deliberate choices, made over years, reinforced by fear, and challenged only after harm became undeniable. And even now, the full cost is still being measured. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.